This lecture will be taking a look at human development. So how does human development begin? It starts with a nature-nurture debate. So genes are nature, where genetics influence almost every aspect of life, where nurture is the environment. The effect of all environmental events will have some sort of influence on your development. Technically speaking, though, both interact to influence your development. So human development starts with prenatal development. We start out as a zygote, which is a fertilized ovum or egg, and to be fertilized, it starts with conception, where the sperm fuses with the egg or ovum. And the gestation period for this is about 38 to 40 weeks, or 9 to 10 months in total. You then go to germinal stage, so that's the first 14 days after conception. It's marked by cell division. The zygote divides to become a multiple cell organism, or a really fun word, blastocyst, and it'll travel down the fallopian tubes to line itself in the uterine walls lining. You then have the embryonic stage, so that's the 3rd to 8th week of formation, and actually a lot of miscarriages and genetic defects will actually occur during this time, and it's because the formation and development of major organs and systems occurring, so it's a very delicate time period. So a lot of times you'll start to see outside develops into support structures and the inside becomes the embryo, and things like the skeletal system, spinal cord, and cardiovascular system will start to develop. So then you go into the 9th week onward to birth, which is the fetal stage, and that's continued growth and maturation, and the organism is now called a fetus. It's usually not until the 6-month or 24-week mark that the fetus has reached viability, but all that means is it has a possibility of surviving outside the womb. It's obviously not ready yet. So during prenatal development, though, there can be some prenatal abnormalities that arise, and a lot of times there's certain environmental aspects that can cause this. So one thing is called Down syndrome. It's where there's an extra 21st chromosome that's negatively impacting physical and cognitive development to varying degrees. There's actually different types of Down syndrome. There's trisomy 21, where all cells have the extra chromosome. Translocation Down syndrome, where part of the 21st chromosome is attached to another chromosome. And mosaic Down syndrome, where some cells have the 21st chromosome and some actually don't. There's also teratogens, so they're environmental agents that can cause harm to the embryo, so things like alcohol, smoking, drug use, diseases, or even chemicals in your environment. And there's sensitive periods, so certain organs and systems are much more vulnerable to the effect of teratogens during specific stages of prenatal development, which you can see on the graph on the right. And then fetal alcohol syndrome. So that's abnormalities that are caused by drinking alcohol during pregnancy. I've actually had clients whose mothers have used alcohol or other substances when pregnant, and a lot of times we end up having to work on issues regarding emotional regulation, impulsivity, resiliency, adaptability, and managing any additional neurodevelopmental disorders, sometimes autism. So now we'll look at physical development in infancy and childhood. Neonate is a newborn, which is during the first 28 days of life, and the brain of infants have billions of neurons with very few connections and incomplete myelin, and during this time, unnecessary connections are actually starting to be discarded during childhood. Because unnecessary connections are discarded during this time, it's usually important to provide stimulating age-appropriate activities to strengthen brain development and ensure fewer connections are discarded. If you remember, earlier in the course, we discussed the case study of Jeannie, the girl who basically was locked away and isolated, and she didn't really develop language or other skills needed for life. This is an extreme example, but an example nonetheless about how the brain requires certain stimulation for development. Children's brains are also highly plastic or changeable and super dense with neurons compared to adult brains, so they can develop and adapt. This doesn't necessarily, though, equate to intelligence. Children need the ability to absorb information for proper development so that they can become more self-sustaining and function as needed in their environment. So when you see children developing so rapidly or picking things up more easily, that's actually why. We as adults have already gone through that process, so it can be interesting when you get to see others go through it. So everything we learn as children will basically help strengthen or sometimes weaken neural connections. With reflexes and motor skills, you'll see a whole bunch develop. The reflex is that automatic response, so infants can learn about their environment. Locomotive ability develops, so their ability to physically move themselves from one place to another. You have gross motor movement, which is large muscle groups like running, walking, jumping. And then fine motor skills, so that's small muscle groups used for like writing or even playing musical instruments or maybe using like a fork and spoon. But infants have a lot of reflexes they're born with to assist them in obtaining food and grasping objects and whatnot. You also see a lot of different aspects with vision emerge. So there's convergence, where it's the ability to focus both eyes on an object. Babies are actually nearsighted at birth, so things are usually really blurry and they're actually still developing their eye structures and neural connections. And then you also have depth perception. So that develops in the first year and allows for one to see the world in 3D and understand distance and spatial relationships. But there are depth perception deficits people can develop or be born with, and it makes it difficult to perceive distance between objects. So individuals can sometimes struggle with driving or fine motor skills, reading, playing sports, and so forth. And some people actually describe it as like seeing things in 2D at times. We also see hearing develop, so fetuses can react to sound in the womb, and a lot of times babies will be able to discriminate between familiar and unfamiliar voices, and they'll be able to locate sound in certain directions and whatnot. Other senses you see develop are taste buds, smell, touch, which are all functional at birth, and then caressing can also help stimulate growth and social development. So now we move on from physical development to cognitive development in infancy and childhood. So a lot of it starts with schemas, assimilation, and accommodation, which is part of Piaget's theory of cognitive development. So like we mentioned in a prior lecture, schemas can be positive or negative and true or false. And Piaget poses that schemas are mental ideas, concepts, or thoughts based on experiences that help organize the world. We have what we call mental equilibrium. So a schema fits your perception or the world. So maybe a child sees a strawberry, it looks really good, and they try it and like it. So this confirms that strawberries are good. We have mental disequilibrium in this theory, where a schema does not fit your perception of the world. So we try to get rid of these to restore equilibrium. So maybe a child sees a lemon. It looks like an orange to them, and they like oranges, so they take a big bite out of the lemon and realize it might not be edible in that way. Though there are people out there who do like to eat lemons like that. And then we have assimilation, applying an existing schema to our understanding of the environment. So some kids refer to all things that fly, such as planes or drones, as birds. And then we also have accommodation, to change or modify our existing schema or create new ones. So maybe we're learning the difference between planes and birds to have a more modified, accurate understanding of it. You see adults go through all of this as well. It's just applied differently. For adults, we usually are trying to go for something new or have to rework faulty schemas and go through a unique process of assimilation and accommodation. This happens a lot in psychology and therapy. You see what someone's schema is, how they assimilate with that schema, and then work to accommodate a more realistic schema that serves a much better purpose in the present. This typically implies that a schema developed for a reason, whether a protective mechanism, lack of guidance, or maybe a lack of knowledge, but it can still be changed. So sticking with Piaget's theory is the sensory motor stage, which is from birth to 2 years of age. So this is where schemas are formed through senses and motor abilities. So in this stage, you're learning through doing or taking action. And there's a lack of what we call object permanence, which is this idea that objects exist even when not present. So object permanence issues also exist in adults. You see this a lot in neurodevelopmental disorders because it impacts organization and memory, leading to like this out of sight, out of mind phenomenon. It can also be seen with emotions, where some individuals struggle with emotional permanence or understanding that emotions can persist even when not actively felt or expressed. I see this a lot in relationships. You could care deeply for someone and feel a sense of love or deep affection and joy, but maybe you're not around that person today, and therefore you are not actively feeling those emotions and sensations as you go about other things. This doesn't mean you don't feel this way towards that person, They exist, but those feelings are usually felt when you think of them or interacting with them. Then it goes to the pre-operational stage, so 2 to 6 to 7 years, and sometimes even 12 years of age. This is where symbolic thinking develops, so understanding objects can be represented with symbols, languages, or gestures. Usually, with symbolic thinking, you'll notice things like words being recognized, vocabulary expanding, and certain objects being associated with certain things. You also have centration, so focusing on one aspect or feature of an object while neglecting other details. So you might have 3 small slices of pizza on your plate, and a child has 2 larger slices of pizza on their plate. And they roughly equate to the same amount of pizza, but the child focuses on the number of slices and therefore believes you have more. We also have conservation. So objects retain original properties even if they look different. You might have seen videos online where a father shaves his beard and his child has difficulty recognizing him for a moment. That's usually what we talk about when we look at conservation. And we also have egocentrism, so believing everyone thinks as you do. Again, adults do this as well. It's usually with more complex, higher stake situations, though. A lot of the times this will be seen in adulthood due to lack of critical thinking skills at times. And then concrete operation stage is 6 to 11 to 12 years of age. So that's where the thinking's starting to mature, and you see it be a lot more logical, but the things kids do will need to be observably tested. So they'll need to keep doing and engaging in things. So it's a lot of times you see many children learn through those experiences or hands-on activities. And then lastly, you have your formal operations development, which is 11 to 12 years and then older. So abstract hypothetical reasoning starts to kick in. So they start considering more of the what if scenarios and what could be, and questioning and imagining a future. So next we have Vygotsky's theory of cognitive development, where he looks at some mental processes are beginning with social interactions, but do not occur in fixed stages like Piaget, and it all depends on environment and culture. So we have private speech or self-talk, and that's when we talk to ourselves to guide our behaviors. It's this internal monitor guiding actions, helping with problem solving, motivation, or even learning new skills. As we get older, private speech goes from being fully externalized to more internalized, as you are thinking your thoughts rather than saying them out loud. Obviously, it comes back because we still do this as adults, and it serves the same purpose. Now, self-talk can be negative in hopes of getting you to magically do better and be better, but it usually feels you leaving pretty awful about yourself and missing out on parts of your life. We also have this zone of proximal development, so it's the gap between what a child can do and what they are not yet capable of doing. And we see what we call scaffolding with this. An adult gradually minimizes guidance as a child will learn new skills. Scaffolding is still seen as you go in teen and young adult years because there's still a lot of skills that are being learned. And so instead of learning how to pour your juice, you're just learning how to drive, how to follow through with commitments, what it means to hold a job, how to apply for school, make a resume, or obtain more freedom, and so forth. Parents are still very much a part of that guidance. So when you're even older, you sometimes have mentors who help guide you, or you find yourself in more positions where you have to figure things out a bit more on your own or decipher where to get help. So Kohlberg created a moral reasoning model, or how we think about right and wrong. So obedience and punishment is stage 1 of it out of 6 stages. And that's where children obey rules to avoid punishment because nobody wants to get punished. Stage 2 is naively egoistic orientation. So it's this morally right action will increase personal rewards and meet our needs. It has this transactional tone to it though, where someone does something for you, so you do something for them, basically. Stage 3 is this good boy / good girl orientation, where moral rightness is very much based on maintaining the approval and or avoiding the disapproval of others. It can lead to people pleasing, but essentially we just want to be viewed positively. Stage 4 is law and order, so moral rightness is based on following rules or laws of society. Exceptions to the rules are absolutely not allowed. Stage 5 is contractual, legalistic orientation. We have exceptions to the rules developing, and they can now be considered as the protection of individual rights is emphasized over societal laws. So maybe you know you broke a rule at home, but no one saw you do it, so therefore it's not valid. No one can prove it. And stage 6 is universal principles orientation. So we're developing our own set of universal principles that guide our judgments of right and wrong across all situations and all societies. This is in relation to your belief system you are developing and how you use that to guide your life and perceptions. Another theory about moral reasoning and gender even was Gilligan. He hypothesized that males and females judge right and wrong very differently, where men focus on fairness and justice and women focus on concern, care, and relations with others. The only thing is research has not supported this theory or found anything to really support this theory whatsoever. So now we can look at the psychosocial development in infancy and childhood. So first we have our temperament. They're characteristic styles of interacting with your surroundings, expressing your needs, very much based on your activity levels, your mood, sleeping or eating habits and patterns, how easily or difficult it is for you to approach or withdraw from people or situations, and even adaptability. Traditionally speaking, though, people used to describe temperament as easy, difficult, and slow to warm up, where easy is you're in a good mood, you have regular sleep and eating patterns, you adapt easily, and you approach new people or situations pretty well. Difficult would be opposite. There's negative emotions, irregular eating, sleeping. Maybe you're not really approaching people or situations. You might be a bit of a grump. And slow to warm up is just in between easy and difficult. You're just taking your time to adapt. So now we'll take a look at attachment, or learning about how we exist in relationships and relate to other people. So attachment is this emotional bond between an infant and someone or something. How we attach or bond to our caregivers very much informs how we attach to others in life and form relationships, especially romantic relationships. And we have 4 main attachment styles. Sometimes they're referred to in different terms, but the most common ones you'll hear about are secure attachment, resistant or anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, and then disorganized/disoriented attachment. I'll go over them in this lecture, but I've also provided an additional video and handout on attachment styles for you in this module. So secure attachment happens when you have caregivers that are a secure, consistent, supportive base of operation. You can go away and return to them without much of an issue. You generally know what to expect from them, and you can generally rely on them. So for example, you know if your caregiver leaves a room, they will come back. With resistant attachment or anxious attachment, you have caregivers that are rather inconsistent in their physical and emotional availability or presence. You typically do not know what to expect from them, and therefore do not have a secure base of operations to function from. It usually leads to a fear of abandonment and sensitivity to rejection, and a strong need for reassurance. You become anxious when the caregiver leaves due to the fear of being abandoned, but become angry when they return because you feel neglected. Another example of inconsistency is maybe you fall off your bike and your caregiver tries to soothe you and ensure you're okay, but maybe it happens again, and this time the caregiver yells at you because you should have known better. With avoidant attachment, you have caregivers who aren't very present, whether it's physically or emotionally. They are absent in some sort of way. So you don't have much of a response to them when they are near or far. It leads to what comes across as indifference and hyper-independence. Again, there's not really a secure base of operations. And with disorganized or disoriented attachment, this is something that typically gets confused with resistant or anxious attachment. It's similar to it, but you have caregivers who are very inconsistent, but they're also very unpredictable in behavior. Usually this is seen in situations of trauma, abuse, and neglect. So it can lead to a fear of abandonment and sensitivity to rejection, but it also leads to a lot of distrust, severe emotional dysregulation, where there's a mix of anxious and avoidant behaviors coming from a place of fear with intimacy and rejection. So a child might appear confused, disoriented, or respond in a way that is not the norm. For example, when they are being comforted, they might look away from the caregiver, or they might not seem fazed by the comfort at all. So there are different variations in parenting styles as well. We have the authoritarian style, which is high control and low levels of warmth and responsiveness. It's very strict parenting, and there's high expectations of obedience. So it's kind of the my way or highway kind of thinking. Usually with this type of parenting, children become very anxious, withdrawn, and conforming. It's hard to think for oneself or explore, and when problems arise, they'll internalize them, as in they will start to act out. You have authoritative, so that's moderate high control, and there's more warmth and responsiveness in it. Expectations are usually clear, but interactions and dialogue will exist with the child. So children tend to be more confident and happy. There's a sense of respect, understanding, and reasonable consistency, which makes it a very effective approach for parenting. And then there's permissive, so it's low control and mixed warmth. You have permissive indulgent, where parents are very warm but maybe make few demands of the child, and permissive neglectful, where parents show little warmth or control of their child. So this style of parenting is the one people tend to associate with the idea of letting the child run everything while the parent is pretty uninvolved. This can lead to a lot of impulsivity and disobedience. However, with the permissive indulgent styles, children are usually more emotionally secure, and with permissive neglectful, children are usually emotionally dysregulated and struggle with self-esteem. It was always interesting when I did therapy with children and adolescents, because how they responded to me in the beginning and the issues that were brought up in therapy were very indicative of how their parents or caregivers treated them or parented them. As they became more comfortable, I usually would see part of their personality start to come out. They would maybe ask questions, their issues at school would lessen, and so forth. But honestly, the majority of the time, it was the parents who usually ended up needing to engage in a lot of the changes and work. So there's a person named Erik Erikson who created stages of psychosocial development. Right now, we're looking at infancy and childhood, but later on in the lecture, we'll look at the ones for adolescence through adulthood. But Erikson said basically how we go through these stages of development greatly impacts our developmental process and even our identity at times. So first we have trust versus mistrust, which is birth to 1 year. And that's when needs are met, we are likely to develop trust in others. So caregivers need to be dependable and reliable. An important event during this time is feeding, and the developmental challenge is going to be developing a sense of security. Autonomy versus shame and doubt is the next stage, ages 1 to 3, where we're balancing a sense of autonomy and dependence. So caregivers really need to be encouraging and supportive, but also manage being too overprotective and causing their children to become too dependent on them. One important event during this time would be potty training, or learning how to do other tasks on your own. If caregivers are unsupportive, as in making demeaning comments or yelling at you in hopes you do better, then you develop shame. So the important challenge is developing a healthy sense of independence. Next stage is initiative versus guilt, ages 3 to 6. So we're being motivated to take initiative, start something on our own, be ambitious, recognize people have expectations. So many children will explore in this phase and better develop their schemas or understanding of the world around them and what they should and should not do. Children are learning how to assert power and control. Sometimes guilt occurs when schemas conflict with what others expect. You see this a lot with how culture expects boys and girls to behave. So the challenge here is trying to go and try new things without being made to feel guilty about what you're trying. And then next we have industry versus inferiority, ages 6 to 12. So we are comparing performance with our peers. We're looking at opinions, activities that make us feel industrious or masterful and competent. So around this time, we can think more logically, but it also means we start comparing ourselves to others. We are also an age where we begin to recognize differences in abilities and how that's being rewarded. So usually school has a large role to play in this. Maybe you get stickers for being good, you are put in certain classes based on your academic performance, or you're praised for all your accomplishments and so forth. What happens is that we begin to form opinions about what makes us feel industrious or competent and what causes us to feel inferior or less capable. This is usually the beginning where we start to see people developing a sense of worth based on what they do rather than who they are. But the major challenge is developing that sense of competence during this time. There's also gender role development occurring throughout this time period of life. So, gender roles and behaviors very much depend on the individual, culture, and society. So, gender roles in psychology are the societal expectations of how males and females should behave. There's what we call gender permanence or gender constancy, and that's recognizing one's assigned gender is fixed and will not be changed. Gender permanence, though, is something children lack, and it's typically noticed when they see a boy with long hair and think they're a girl, when in reality they're a boy, or the opposite occurs. But just because someone looks a certain way does not indicate the truth. We also have gender schema theory, which suggests that modeling and reinforcement will work in tandem to help children develop an understanding of gender. In this sense, children learn a lot about gender from caregivers, environment around them, especially since parents are the first source of information around gender and many other things. A great way to analyze this is looking back and seeing what jobs and tasks your parents took on. You also recognize the differences in what boys and girls are encouraged to do when they grow up, or how peers reinforce certain gender norms. Society also contributes to this through whole blue being for boys and pink being for girls and how they label toys. And then gender is also influenced by genetics and your own perceptions and beliefs. So your genetics, perceptions, and beliefs are what account for the differences we usually see in gender, sexuality, and behaviors. But it's not always so black and white for everyone. For some it is, others it's not. And nowadays, gender permanence is shifting into different realms. So now we're moving on to adolescence and adulthood, and we'll start with the physical development during that time. So in adolescence, that's when we start to go through puberty and certain brain changes. Puberty is a process of sexually maturing, and it's usually completed within 4 to 5 years of onset. So a lot of times changes will start more in the back of the brain and eventually slowly move towards the front of the brain. Usually during this time you have a lot of growth, development of new neurons and connections in a lot of areas. Unneeded neural connections will be pruned or, sent away. Gray matter in the prefrontal cortex increases. You'll notice there's a lot of behavioral changes, although emotionality and impulsivity have not completed maturation yet. And the brain changes correlate with behavior, but it doesn't always cause behavior. So puberty does have an emotional and psychological impact, especially on self-image. As your body changes, so does your sense of self, and usually people get bullied for some of these changes. Plus, changes can also create insecurity. And when we feel insecure, we are more prone to conform to societal expectations, norms, or peer pressure. That's why it's really important to have a support system that's encouraging and understanding. A lot of times too, as I mentioned, people will go through different emotional changes, but people will usually blame moodiness on hormonal fluctuations for both males and females during puberty. And this is true, but it's important to note that because adolescents are also under such stress during these times of school, peers, expectations, and so forth, the cortisol released from the stress will actually impact the hormonal balance and actually cause further moodiness during these times. And also, the brain is still not fully developed, which does play a role in behaviors not being super sound or logical all the time, and even impulsivity. But a lot of people blame all adolescent behavior on their brain development, and I'll sometimes get even parents and adolescents who do the same in therapy. The catch is that adolescents are at an age where they can appropriately understand certain things, like consequences to behaviors. They just do not always have the life experience to help them make decisions or the proper guidance. And we also hear a lot the brain fully develops or matures around age 25. However, all this means is that your structural and functional development is complete. So you have the ability to become more adept with problem solving, impulse control, emotional regulation, planning, and so forth. You do not just obtain these skills, you still have to develop and refine them. Your brain's just in a better state to do so. Now, sometimes people, for a variety of reasons, don't develop certain skill sets, and that's why you see certain adults struggle with things like emotional regulation and impulsivity. And as you develop, physically you'll start to notice changes from early to later adulthood. So early adulthood is typically peak years of physical health. So you're looking more into late 20s and early 30s. So things like strength, stamina, dexterity, vision, and hearing are usually at their best. Aging can bring slower metabolism, so weight gain, and even thinning hair, gray hair, loss of muscle mass, and so forth. And aging is inevitable, but not all declines are. Lifestyle factors greatly contribute to how you age. So, like diet, substance use, exercise. Obviously, everyone's different in how they age depending upon certain conditions, disorders, dietary exercise habits, and other factors you may or may not be dealing with. But genetics also play a large role in this as well. And positive perceptions of aging can also lead to more preventative health behaviors and longevity. How we perceive this aging really does impact us psychologically and can make the rest of our lives a very stressful and dreadful experience or positive one. The reason being is that a lot of people tend to focus so much on how to remain in what they consider to be their youth because they believe, through what they're taught, that it's as good as it'll get. So, a positive perception of aging can help people view it as a part of life that you get to look forward to, like many parts of life. And this can motivate people to care for themselves physically and mentally because they have more still to live for. And we all age, and each phase comes with something, but life has things you have to deal with all the time anyway. So you just adjust and adapt and change as you go, and sometimes you like it and sometimes you don't. So, based on your gender, your reproductive capacity also will start to change. So, with females, the fertility begins with menstruation and will start to steadily decrease from age 15, usually all the way to age 50. And by age 50, at some point around that time, you're going through perimenopause, menopause, and postmenopause. So, perimenopause typically begins in the 40s. So it's a transition before menopause that can be a few months or years, which during this phase, estrogen starts to significantly drop, slowly impacting the eggs released from the ovaries, and the uterus will start to shrink. And usually you'll start to have irregularities in periods, hot flashes, night sweats, sleep issues, changes in sexual desire, mood changes, skin and hair changes, weight gain, and so forth. And then you go into menopause, which is typically around age 50. So menstruation has completely stopped for 12 consecutive months, and females can no longer have children. You'll still have all the same symptoms of perimenopause, but at this point, you just can't have children anymore. And then you enter postmenopause. So it's the time after menopause where your body is adjusting to hormonal changes. So females stay there the rest of their lives after that, and there can still be mild menopausal symptoms for a few years, but the body usually adjusts at some point. But there is an increased risk for osteoporosis during this time because of low estrogen. Now, with males, they experience what they call andropause around the age of 60, and andropause is not a male menopause. Usually, it's just a gradual decline in the male hormone testosterone, and the lower concentration of sperm and semen will be seen, and loss of hair can also be seen. But men are still capable of reproduction and sexual activity. Usually, men will just experience lower libido, maybe erectile dysfunction, fatigue, loss of muscle mass, and so forth. So, now we'll look at the cognitive development in adolescence and adulthood. So, it starts with formal operations. So, like we mentioned earlier, Piaget has a theory on cognitive development and noted that around adolescence, the ability to think more abstractly develops. So, we're thinking about the what ifs and what could be, which he's terming our formal operations. And during this time, we have what we call idealism of youth, where adolescents are having insights into how things could be, basically. And egocentrism returns. Now, egocentrism in adolescence is a bit different. Typically, it appears in adolescents thinking others are concerned with them as they are about themselves, or that everyone is thinking about them all the time. They really start to become very self-conscious. So part of this egocentrism is the imaginary audience, this belief that others are watching and noticing us. This imaginary audience can still be present in adulthood. A lot of adults are self-conscious and will try to dress or even behave in a certain way to be positively accepted by others or to not be judged. And then another part of egocentrism is the personal fable. It's this belief that one is immune to the dangers of all ill-advised behaviors, and maybe you're unique in a way that nobody else could ever relate to. And this can be an integral part of identity development as adolescents are differentiating themselves from others, so they're seeing how they're different. So personal fable, though, is rather dangerous at times because it can contribute to what we call risk-taking behaviors like unprotected sex, because some adolescents believe negative outcomes just won't ever apply to them. I see this a lot with adolescents, actually. Other ones that come up are thinking their feelings or opinions are the only valid ones, that they're the only ones who feel a certain way, or rejecting advice due to an inflated sense of self-importance and believing they already know everything. You can definitely still see this occur in adulthood as well, and these are not always applicable to every person. It's just what can be common during this period. However, these things can also be impacted and stem from how people are raised, how they go through their various developmental stages, and even interactions with peer, society, and culture. So then we start going into what's called post-formal thought. So during this time, experiences greatly assist with reasoning, problem solving, making decisions. We still need those in adulthood as well. A lack of experiences really keep us in this black and white or dualistic thinking, which dualistic thinking is usually what we start with in adolescence. It's this reasoning that's divided into either right or wrong categories. And then as we get older, we are much more capable of what we call relativistic thinking, which many situations aren't necessarily right or wrong. There's not just one answer for something. We start seeing more complexities. And so you get that post-formal thought. The correct solution can vary depending upon circumstances. Situations are seen in less either or terms. We'll also start to see certain changes in mental abilities. For example, fluid intelligence. This relies on our information processing skills like reaction time and our working memory. And this is thought to be based on biology, where we also have crystallized intelligence, which relies on knowledge, expertise, and judgment. And that's very much thought to be based on nature, nurture, and experiences. And if you look at the graph on the right, you'll start to see how verbal meaning, spatial orientation, or inductive reasoning will vary over time. So now we get to move into the psychosocial development of adolescence and adulthood. And here we're going to revisit Erik Erikson's psychosocial stages of change. And this one will be for adolescence and adulthood, so 12 all the way to 65 and older. So with this one, ages 12 to 18 is what's called identity versus role confusion. So this is the integration and summation of our childhood into an appropriate identity. So during this time, you're identifying your values, how you are similar and dissimilar to your peers and parents. Maybe you're thinking about what you want for your future, trying out different behaviors, friend groups, clothes, hobbies. This identity is very much influenced by all the changes you go through biologically during this time. However, if we tend to constantly try out various roles and bounce from one thing to the next without making commitments or any real follow-through, then we can end up in role confusion or this unstable identity because we've tried all these things without really giving anything much of a chance. So we don't always learn about ourselves, challenge ourselves, or develop adaptability and capacity to deal with things. And we don't know where we fit in. That's why we see commitment and follow through being such an important aspect of life. The next stage people will go into is intimacy versus isolation, which is around ages 18 to 40. And that is forming a stable identity and you're prepared to make long-term commitments to a partner. So this stage requires us to refine and modify our identities so we can accommodate another person. But neither person's identities are compromised or lost ideally. This would be, like I said, ideal because it's indicative of a secure attachment style. One way to think about this is in the shape of a triangle. At the bottom two corners of the triangle are you and your partner. Each of you have your values, beliefs, goals, hobbies, and so forth. At the top of the triangle, you have the relationship, but this is where you have shared values, beliefs, experiences, goals, and so forth. So you get to exist within a relationship and outside of a relationship in this way. Now, if you have a relationship that's open, or as we say, ethically non-monogamous, you're basically adding in some extra triangles, and you and your partner decide how you each relate to those other relationships. So, if intimacy, let's say, is developed, we have cooperation, acceptance, tolerance, bonds, emotional warmth. If we end up developing isolation, it's usually we feel reluctant to connect with others and loneliness can ensue. Or if we don't connect with others, we can start to become defensive and have low tolerance for another person's differences. A lot of this is typically attributed to the attachment styles we actually discussed. Then the next stage from ages 40 to 65 are generativity versus stagnation. So these are feelings that we have made a significant and meaningful contribution to society and the world. People really become aware of their age and mortality more around this time, and many want to feel like they've had meaningful lives, whether it's accomplishing goals, contributing somehow to society, developing relationships in a community, and so much more. If that's the case, we develop generativity and tend to seek out those experiences and accomplishments that further produce this. It's important because generativity can actually assist in overall positive well-being. If stagnation develops, we start to feel a sense of loss, failure, a lack of meaning or purpose in life. Many times I see people struggle with this when they hold various regrets, they lack relationships and communities, and they struggle to commit and follow through with things. And then lastly, we have integrity versus despair, which is for ages 65 and older. So you're judging the satisfaction of your life choices. So integrity is when we feel most positive recounting our lives and feel we can face the prospect of death more peacefully, where despair leads us to a sense of hopelessness and anxiety because we recount our lives and feel like it wasn't lived to its fullest potential. We also have what we call emerging adulthood during this time, and that is this time between teenage years and when one starts to assume adult responsibilities. You are becoming an adult essentially, and usually this time spent in the pursuit of maybe education, building a career, traveling, building relationships. In non-Western cultures, there's usually no delay between teen years and adult roles, where in Western cultures we see more of a delay. And the age we emerge into adulthood varies based on resources, education, parenthood, economy, and so much more. Usually emerging adulthood was typically around the ages of 18 in Western culture, but with more people attending college, it was pushed to about age 22. And today, because of a lot of economic factors, it's seen more in people's mid to late 20s and sometimes even their 30s with emerging into adulthood. So adolescents and adults have a lot of variations in their social relationships with other people. And keep in mind, though, this differs from culture to culture. But dating and singlehood are very different. Nowadays, we have online dating to where we're just hanging out, hooking up, just talking. It's just casual, and so forth. Usually during this time, we're learning to cooperate and compromise. And we're also learning a lot about ourselves and how other people's needs may differ. And nowadays we're dating multiple people at a time. And dating is a bit more of a commodity. It's kind of like shopping for a sweater, unfortunately, where you go find one, try it out, don't like it, and try to return it for another one. We also have cohabitation, nowadays where we're living with an intimate partner. And in a way, it can be a trial phase prior to marriage. And marriage is drastically different. We once married as a transaction to sustain life, wealth, etc., where we now have the opportunity to marry for love or convenience or really whatever you want it to be. But divorce rates have also increased. 1 in 5 adults will at some point in their lives experience a divorce. And usually the reason being for that is divorce is more of an option than it ever used to be. I mean, women usually weren't able to open a bank account until sometime in the 70s. So divorce just wasn't much of a thing or much of an option for a variety of other reasons even. During this phase, you'll also see parenting becoming a thing if people so choose to have a child. And the demands of parenting don't really ease as a child grows older. Each child receives a very different version of their parents based on their needs. And as parents typically become comfortable in their parenting style, is usually when it ends up having to change because they need to keep up with those demanding needs. And parents a lot of times will then have to adjust discipline to meet those new challenges. You also see parenthood tends to correlate sometimes with lower rates of marital satisfaction and higher levels of stress. And a lot of times marriage and relationships really are impacted by having children because time's not your own anymore. And usually what happens is people struggle to prioritize their relationship and themselves because obviously you, rightfully so, are learning how to be a new parent and meet the needs of your child, which is 24/7. Adolescence and adulthood is also when people start, unfortunately, experiencing death or loss of loved ones. And there's this Kubler-Ross 5-stage grief model where it sees emotional and psychological changes people might experience as they confront death. Now, the sequence experienced varies. It's not like a linear stepped process. You might go from one to another and then back on over to step one. But usually what you get is denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Denial is basically, this isn't happening. How could this be happening? Anger is, how could you leave me? Why would you just leave me alone? Why would you betray me like this? Bargaining is, if I just did something differently, then maybe this wouldn't have happened. Or if I could see them again, I would just do X, Y, or Z. Depression is this deep, deep sorrow and grief. And then acceptance is where you grow around the loss, not get over it. You just grow around it because you're not ever going to forget it. We also have what we call ambiguous loss, which is this loss of something that was very present in our minds but has not occurred in real life, such as having children, a dream job, living in a certain place, and so forth. These aspects may not have occurred and will never occur for a variety of reasons, so we still have to deal with what it is to not have those ideals. And then we have this concept of bereavement and grief, where bereavement is the experience of losing a loved one, and grief is the emotional response we have to this loss. Cultures have many prescribed rituals to assist in these grieving processes, but one model suggests that grieving might involve several stages. So that's the impact phase, which may include disbelief, numbness, painful emotions of loss. You then have confrontation stage, which is uncontrollable weeping, despair, guilt, anger, anxiety. And then the accommodation phase, so you're re-engaging with life and the memories of the deceased are internalized but not forgotten. And within this, you can kind of see Kubler-Ross's 5 stages as well. And then that concludes our lecture.